It's Monday, July 28th, and this storm system is about to bring some record-breaking temperatures to much of the United States from a corridor stretching all the way from the eastern seaboard to parts of the Midwest and northern plains. We're going to see that this increased trend of some extremely hot temperatures around the 110s is going to move westward as we go throughout the day, but starting around lunchtime back here along the eastern seaboard, we're going to see some feels like temperatures around 112 out here specifically in South Carolina, and pretty much anywhere between 105 and 110 throughout the entire eastern seaboard. As we move forward into the mid-afternoon, we're going to see a extremely hot spot out here in parts of the Midwest and northern to central plains with some temperatures around 110. And unfortunately, it looks like this area will just be absolutely cooked with these temperatures from the early afternoon all the way up until sunset, and then areas pretty much the entire Great Plains will be experiencing anywhere between 100 to 105 feels like temperatures. And as we move throughout the day, we're going to see that these extremely hot temperatures are unfortunately just going to sit on our region out here back in parts of the central plains and Midwest. And then today we actually have a decently large area of severe weather expected out here in the northern plains, stretching into parts of the northern Midwest with a slight risk which expands all the way from eastern Montana all the way back into parts of northern Iowa and western Wisconsin, with an associated marginal risk of severe weather surrounding it, then just widespread thunderstorms pretty much across the entire U.S., with an area of possibly some strong thunderstorms back out here in the mid-Atlantic and southeast as per usual. Now, the main threat with this storm system is going to be the threat for some strong damaging winds, with an increased chance in a corridor stretching all the way from eastern South Dakota into parts of southern Minnesota, where I believe we could see some strong damaging winds around 70 miles an hour today. And then we have this 5% chance of severe winds, which stretches all the way back into parts of Montana. In that area, there is just that conditional threat for some 60 mile an hour damaging gusts. Then our hail threat is going to cover much of the same area, except it's going to be a little bit more westward with a increased corridor from parts of central Montana all the way back into parts of South Dakota, where I do believe we could see some hail around 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter today. And there is just that conditional 5% risk, which spans much of that marginal risk area for severe weather. Then there is actually going to be a small risk for tornadoes today. Now, I do think this is going to rely on where an outflow boundary is, and wherever that outflow boundary is, I do think we could see an upgrade to a 5% tornado risk in that area. But for now, the main threat is just going to be some pretty weak spin-up tornadoes along a line of thunderstorms. So I definitely do think there is the risk of potentially even a slightly strong tornado today. And there is going to be a risk of flooding today out here in parts of eastern South Dakota and back into Minnesota, where I think much of this slight risk of excessive rainfall could see areas receiving 4 inches of rain today. Now, there is a associated marginal risk, and I do think in that marginal risk in our others, one is going to be back here in parts of the mid-Atlantic and another one in the desert Southwest. I do think there's that conditional threat for 1 to 2 inches of rain as well, although there could be some isolated areas receiving 3 inches in those areas. And then here's what our storm evolution is going to look like today. We're actually going to see the ingredients are going to be laid by Sunday afternoon storms, which are going to leave an outflow boundary likely anywhere between the South Dakota and Minnesota border. And along that outflow boundary is going to be a corridor for the strongest storms. But it looks like our first storms of the day are going to be actually on the morning hours along an area of some troughing up here. Now, these storms would primarily bring a threat of some potentially large hail and damaging gusts, and those storms will likely fizzle out by around midday, just becoming a rainmaker up there. But we're going to see our other first sign of storms along our outflow boundary back in South Dakota and Minnesota around the early afternoon hours, where we're actually going to see a bit of a front and a low pressure system moving eastward throughout South Dakota. And along this, we're going to see the initiation of a couple of storms. We're in the earlier stages. They could bring that threat for some larger hail between 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter. And I actually do think there is a pretty robust threat of seeing some damaging gusts in excess of 70 miles today in this region. Then when they attach the outflow boundary, there is going to also be that conditional threat of a stronger tornado, but it's mostly just going to be the threat of a couple of weak spin-up tornadoes along this mostly linear area of storms. And our last area, which could see some storm initiation, is going to be back here in parts of Montana, where there is a conditional threat of a couple of storms, bringing that mostly large hail and damaging wind threat with actually a non-zero chance of tornadoes, although I think that's going to be pretty low. And it looks like all of our severe weather is going to be done as we go into Tuesday morning. And then here are 500 millibar winds. This is showing us what's bringing that large scale forcing for these storms. And we're actually going to see our first area of storms up here in North Dakota being initiated by a short wave in the morning hours, which is going to help to initiate and strengthen those storms. Then our next short wave that we're going to see is going to be down here along our low pressure system and cold front area in parts of South Dakota and southern Minnesota, which is going to help to initiate that second cluster of storms. And we're actually going to see another short wave back in Montana. So a lot of short waves today helping to initiate our storms. And this one is going to bring that cluster back here in parts of Montana. And of course, there's going to be that very strong high pressure system bringing that record breaking heat across much of the US today as well. And then that's going to be centered on pretty much the southern to central plains. Now here is a snapshot of our environment in parts of South Dakota and Minnesota, and even that front which stretches down into parts of Nebraska. And we can see that there is going to be some tornadic characteristics of this photograph, although it's not super favorable. But the main thing is that we're going to see the threat of a couple of high base storms with a very robust setup for some strong damaging winds and some pretty large hail. We do have some dry air aloft, a 63 dew point, a very high cloud base, and then a extremely pretty unstable environment at around 4,000 cape. This could be anywhere between 4 to 5,000 down here. We see a downdraft cape nearing 1,800, which is extremely high, than a relative humidity of anywhere between 45 to 30%, which would help with that evaporative cooling and thus bring some stronger severe gusts. Then we also have a precipitable water of 1.59 inches, which would also help to support that threat for some strong downdrafts. So this is why I do think we could see a couple of storms bringing some 70-mile-an-hour gusts to this region. But as we go closer to the outflow boundary, our environment is actually going to change to be a bit more conducive. Now here's a look at the environment near the outflow boundary, and immediately our hodograph is going to have a much larger curve, and we're going to have a lot more bulk or organizing shear. Then our regular shear and helicity in the lower levels is just going to be much more conducive for the threat of tornadoes. And there's also going to be some wind veering, and our cloud base is going to be lowered significantly. Now there is going to be a larger amount of cape near our outflow boundary, probably closer to 5,000. This model says close to 8,000, which is absurd, and it's just not going to happen at all. There also is that higher threat of some flooding because there's going to be a higher precipitable water around 2 inches along the outflow boundary. But the main thing that's going to happen as we go closer to the outflow boundary is that there's going to be the higher threat for a couple of lower based tornadic storms. And here's a look from a bit more north in that area, primarily initiated by some troughing in North Dakota and Montana. Immediately, we're going to see a straighter hodograph and a lot of organizing shear around 46 knots. We're also going to see a lower cloud base, which is why I think that tornado threat is not zero, but it's also going to be very low because our shear isn't really going to be that conducive for much going on out here. But we do have a moist area for the environment in the higher elevations, and also a modestly unstable environment at anywhere between 2,500 to 3,000 cape, which would be very conducive for just general severe weather. We also see some dry air aloft helping with the lift of those storms, and also possibly some strong severe gusts around 60 miles an hour. There also is the threat of some large hail with these storms because there's quite a bit of cape, a low freezing level, and a nice mid-level lapse rate at around 8.2 Celsius decrease per kilometer. Then there's also a pretty decent 3 cape at over 100, which is why I think that tornado threat isn't zero, but it's still going to be pretty low. Then that's just going to be conducive for general severe weather. So mostly some damaging gusts around 60 miles an hour, and then possibly some hail, possibly being large at around 1.5 inches to 2 inches up in Montana and North Dakota.